Welcome to Mental Stillness. My name is Derek, and I'm excited that somehow you stumbled across this podcast. One of my goals when starting this podcast was to bring mental health conversations into leadership circles. In today's episode, I speak with Jeremy Hurewitz. I came across a book recently called Sell Like a Spy. It grabbed my attention for many reasons, but as I started reading the book, I started to realize that there are a ton of lessons from the spy tradecraft that translate very well into leadership and psychology. And so I wanted to have the author on to talk about this book and about his career and lessons that we can learn together. So I reached out to the author, Jeremy Hurewitz. He started his career overseas as a freelance journalist for a decade, based out of Prague and Shanghai. During that time, he built and ran the International Newspaper Association, Project Syndicate. Upon his return to New York, which is where he's from, Jeremy joined the world of corporate security. Jeremy describes this line of work as influential, but a little-known industry. Jeremy works with intelligence officers and other foreign government officials across a range of services, including kidnap-for-ransom consulting, background investigations, executive protection, and many other sensitive assignments. So in his book, Sell Like a Spy, it brings the spy tradecraft to business and also everyday communications. It really is a remarkable book that has very practical strategies to help in communication. It has stories that spread across his different experience in different places. And I know you're going to benefit greatly from this conversation, and there's going to be some very practical next steps. So enjoy the episode.
Yes, I'm from the New York City area, but after college, and I went to University of Massachusetts at Amherst, I had a bit of wanderlust, and I went overseas for just under a decade. I showed up in Europe with a backpack and a guitar in the late 90s, and I stayed in Prague for 7 years, and then I went to Shanghai for another 2. And I was a journalist, wrote for a variety of different publications around the world, and I also helped build and run a newspaper association that I'm quite proud of called Project Syndicate. Back in New York, I've been in corporate consulting, corporate security, essentially for, wow, it's getting close to 2 decades now. And, sometimes people call that world corporate espionage. A lot of former intelligence officers, others, former hostage negotiators, special forces types. And I have worked on a variety of different, security projects and intelligence investigations. I work regularly on these projects, and they have introduced me to, a lot of different skill sets, which caused me for a while to think about the book that I eventually wrote, Sell Like a Spy. But it was during COVID that, I think it was just unique to me that I kind of had this feeling of, hey, I'm ready to go out on my own. I don't want to go to an office again every day. I want to write more. So that's what I did. That's what I do. I wrote this book. I go around the country, around the world somewhat, to speak about how to bring the tradecraft of spies and other senior government officials into your communications, both business-wise, everyday life. I've even talked to people about dating and using some of those skills. And I'm still an advisor to a security firm. We're actually quite busy. I do a lot of work with them. It's called Interfor International. And I have a variety of other writing projects. So, and I still live in the New York City area, and I spend a lot of time in Vermont as well.
Well, I know when I came across your work, Jeremy, I was drawn to it, as we've discussed, from the leadership lens, from the psychology lens, from relational management, for lack of a better word. And I know you cover a lot of this in your book as I've read it, but just share with our audience a little bit of the relational management skills that spies possess.
Yeah, we could probably spend a lot of time just talking about just that.
Pick some of your favorites.
Yeah, I mean, that's what caused me to do this. Look, I come from a background of salesmen. My grandfather, my father. Relationships are everything, and I've seen it in my professional career where what I say to audiences a lot is that unless your product or service is totally differentiated or you have a price point that blows competition out of the water, it's relationships that matter. And they can often be the critical difference in a marketplace that, let's face it, is oftentimes undifferentiated. No matter how, how great your company is, there's competitors. They're often not that different. And the relationship side is what's important. And I'm kind of on a mission, Derek, to reframe how people think of spies and get it away from the world of James Bond and Jason Bourne. And I enjoy all those movies, of course, but I don't think it serves spies that well in some respects because we don't appreciate their true brilliance. They're often socially gifted individuals who have been trained to leverage those gifts in ways that enable them to do what I call making the world's most difficult sale, which is convincing someone to buy into the concept of treason, which is what they do. And if you talk to a lot of former case officers, there's motivations for why people will buy into that sale, right? And they mirror what we see in the business world too, to some extent. And you look at people's motivations, and I often tell people in the business world they don't do enough on thinking about the motivation. They think I'm a charming person, I have a great product or service, they should want to buy. But spies are great at understanding people's motivations, and they will oftentimes find that motivation aside, whether it's, getting healthcare for a sick kid, whether it's money, whether it's grievance, many times case officers will tell you that the people that are their agents do it because of the relationship. They will say, I'm only doing this because of you. And it's difficult because the CIA doesn't want case officers managing an agent for more than a couple of years. And there's good reasons for that, which we could talk about. But many times the agent is so close to the handling case officer that that can be a challenge. And I think it just goes to show how important relationships are. They're everything to us as human beings. The work that you do, Derek, you would certainly know very well. They're the most important thing in our lives, our relationships. And that goes to the business world as well. And you have friends, you build strong relationships, and that's how we should be approaching relationship cultivation, understanding how, we seek comfort, we seek allies, understanding the challenges that, go against that, understanding some of the biases that leaders face in who they cultivate, and why they choose to. So that's some thoughts there. I'll just close by saying that, what I found right away working with case officers is that they're the most intellectually omnivorous group of people you'll ever find. They can talk about just about anything. Intellectual curiosity is one of the through lines in that group. And they're extraordinary at kind of, understanding people and trying to figure out, what is important to them. So they're just great people to be around, and I have a ton of respect for them.
One of the things you talk about in your book too is this idea of, these case officers they're rubbing shoulders with some people who might be very challenging. I'll say that, challenging personalities. And to the leaders that are listening you have people on your team, or maybe you're going in to do a sales pitch and you just know that you do not jive with that other person. What are some strategies that you've picked up along the way and observed of how people can navigate some very complex personalities that you probably disagree a lot with? How can you still be productive?
Yeah, for sure. And look, again, with human nature, we look for comfort. We look for people like us. When people rub us the wrong way, it's our nature to want to go in the opposite direction. So, as you alluded to, spies have to cultivate people that they probably wouldn't want anything else to do with. We're talking about criminals and terrorists and diplomats from some really terrible countries, and they have to uphold those policies. And so, it's not even just the personalities, as you referred to. They can be very prickly, but you could find a very charming diplomat from Iran who you could trace back to some extremely repugnant policies, but they could be very debonair and charming. So a good spy, a good case officer will understand all of that. And they practice what's known as radical empathy, sometimes called tactical empathy. I believe in your world, Derek, you call it like unconditional positive regard, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Yep. Carl
Right.
Rogers.
Right. So, it's certainly not only spies who think about this, but it is such a great personality strategy of dealing with difficult people. There's a quote, I don't know if it really, if he actually said this, but it's attributed to Abraham Lincoln, who supposedly said, I don't like that person. I must get to know him better. So it's about working really hard to unearth that kernel of humanity that's there's no scientific basis for this, but I estimate that there's, 99% of humanity has a redeeming quality. There's very few people that are just rotten to the core. We're all complex. We all have shades of these different things. So a spy is really good at, discerning that, this criminal is actually a devoted family man. This terrorist practices acts of charitable good, and they don't overlook the negative, but they focus on the positive. They use, as we discussed earlier, intellectual curiosity to get at the heart of that individual and find areas of common overlap. And they're almost always there. A lot of times it's bedrock things like family or faith or other things, and they find ways to relate in understanding the societies they're in as well. But it's all about trying to find common areas and being patient and digging deeper and finding areas that you can build on to get to know that person.
Some time ago, I saw, and this is a subset. This is by no means a universal data point, but it's enough to pique interest. University of Michigan found that a study within college students that there's been a decline in empathy of up to 40%, and that came out in 2021. And it's interesting when you think about the skills behind it, or the motivation, or even people feeling like they even need to empathize. At least within that study would show that it's dropped, and then you kind of pair that with, there's a correlation in empathy and engagement. And so back to the workforce, like, if you're worried about the engagement of your workforce, now I'm biased in this, and but I would say start with empathy. Like, figure out, like, what's the empathic temperature, like, what kind of empathy does the top level leadership have with the team? And
Yeah.
I would start there. So I don't know if you have
Yeah,
any
absolutely.
reflections on that.
Yeah, I'm dying to share a couple thoughts there. First of all, one of the contributors to the book, my friend and someone I deeply admire, Steve Romano, who's a former chief hostage negotiator at the FBI, he likes to say that empathy is the WD-40 of communications. So empathy is the basis, along with listening, for all of these communication skills. And I wasn't aware of that study, and I appreciate you sharing that with me because it dovetails with both my work and I think what we're seeing around the country. Briefly on my work, one of the biggest drivers of the training I do is on poor emotional intelligence of younger people entering the workforce. I have so many people who are saying to me, we have these brilliant young people, and they, for instance, they're two doors down, the hallway, and they'll send a text instead of just walking over to talk with somebody who would value the face to face, and they're missing important social and professional cues by sending a text and an email instead of actually talking to somebody. So I go in and I try to train them with some of these skills. And these kids have had they have a couple strikes against them because they grew up looking at screens, which I bet impacts the empathy thing. Then many of them were in college or law school or grad school during COVID, and they have faced remote learning. And now they are in a situation where they're in oftentimes work remote environments, and they don't have the opportunity for mentorship, for impromptu lunches and happy hours and things that really help me grow. This is a big challenge, and you do need to practice that radical empathy, even if it's not somebody that is a loathsome individual. You need to work hard to relate to people, even when it doesn't come naturally, and that's especially important for leaders. A good leader is going to meet somebody where they are and not necessarily expect them to reach their lofty level and get on their level every time they talk. A good leader is going to make people comfortable and try to understand where they're coming from.
Let's talk a little bit around this idea of vulnerability. And obviously, vulnerability is something that, it's a spectrum. There's some people hear vulnerability and they have a picture of what that is, and they run from it, and other people run toward it. Give me an idea of kind of what you learned within your experience around vulnerability.
Yeah, vulnerability breeds humanity, and humanity breeds credibility. I often talk about vulnerability being a way to narrow an intimacy gap. Okay. And, you're sitting with a client and they have their formal attire on, their formal face on, they know that you're in there pitching your product or service or trying to build a relationship, whatever it is. I like to say life is sales. And even though not all of us are engaged very specifically in selling a product or service, all of us are trying to convince people a lot of the time in many aspects of our jobs. So, and people put their guard up a little bit on that. And it gets back to the radical empathy thing. Sometimes we hit it off with people, and other times there's more distance. So making yourself vulnerable and sharing about yourself in a very calculated and smart way, and that's an important caveat, can really narrow that gap. And what I tell audiences about, and I think, I try to use myself as an example, is that I had a brain tumor a little over 10 years ago, which was benign, but it led to me losing all hearing out of my right ear. And that's been an adjustment. And there are very tactical reasons it comes up. Why am I walking on the street and kind of going around you to keep you on my left? Why, if I'm late for a business luncheon and folks are seated, will I potentially ask if I could swap seats with somebody to keep the table on my left in a loud restaurant? So this comes up, and what you see again is that empathy, right? That WD-40 of communications. All of a sudden, somebody that had been keeping me at arm's length all of a sudden tells me something very intimate about themselves or a loved one as well after I've shared this. And that's one of the examples of behavioral science. Like we want to share, we want to connect, and we almost automatically respond to circumstances in kind. If I tell you that, Derek, you're going to want to share some experience with me. It's very strong in human beings that we want to relate. So spies know this. They're trained in this, and they do this. In my book, I talk about a case officer who actually became station chief in the Middle East in some really important cities. He's one of the people that aren't named in the book. I had to respect that here and there. But he talks about how, in these Middle Eastern countries, there's a really big emphasis on discussing family. And he opened up about a child he has on the autism spectrum. And he believes it was essential in helping to grow relationships with people who became his agent. So, making yourself vulnerable is a great way to deepen that connection. Again, you have to use your emotional intelligence to figure out the right time. You don't want to just blurt out some horrific news about yourself or a loved one in the middle of things. You have to figure out the right moment. It also doesn't have to be something so heavy. I tell people, if you've arrived at a meeting and there was a sudden downpour and you don't have an umbrella and you're complaining about how wet your feet are, that encourages the same thing. People, oh, I got caught in the rain last week, or, something like that, or complaining about your teenager being insolent or something. It can be something smaller, but sharing your humanity is a really key aspect of vulnerability.
We all get pictures of spies, often formed from Hollywood, and it seems like they're always trying to transfer or gather information. And I know you talk a lot about elicitation. So how can a business leader learn from a spy when it comes to elicitation? So I guess defining it and then also sharing about the skill itself.
Sure. Elicitation's fun. It might be the most sought after thing I talk about. People find it really compelling because it's like, I give an example about a CIA training exercise where they want people to approach somebody on the street and learn as much as they can from that person, but without asking a question. And people are just, how do you learn without asking a question? So I talk about that, and it is a little bit of it builds off of vulnerability, and it builds off of behavioral science. We have these triggers in who we are as human beings that cause us to react in certain ways. So elicitation is a little bit more of a circumspect way to gather information, a more subtle way to collect intelligence. So if I was to say to you, hey, Derek, your favorite color is blue, right? You would say, no, my favorite color is not blue. It's red, because in human beings, there's what's known as a tendency to correct. We're all egotistical in our own way. No matter how humble you think you are, it's very important for us to correct any small detail about ourselves, right? So most of the time when you say something to somebody, I call this the premeditated attempt at elicitation, you can get them to share something about themselves. And it can usually be in a way that is more useful than asking the question. I often use the surprise party example. We're throwing a party for you, Derek. We want to have your favorite food there. If I was to call you and ask you, hey, Derek, tell me what your favorite food is again, you might think, what's going on? Why did he ask that? I have this birthday coming up, and you might put two and two together. But if I invite you to a Thai restaurant next week and say, hey, didn't you tell me Thai is your favorite food? You'd feel strongly compelled to correct me and tell me what your favorite food is. So I elicited that information. So I have a variety of examples about how there are triggers in behavioral science that can help you get to that information. And they include things like, professional pride. people want to brag a little bit about their work. And if you can trigger professional pride from a client of yours, you might learn more details than you would if you asked directly, and you would earn less suspicion, and concern about why you're asking. There's you get people to gossip. They'll tell you things they didn't intend to tell you. Awkward silences. People hate awkward silences. They tend to blurt out things. So there are triggers for elicitation that I write about pretty extensively in the book, that spies use to collect intelligence, and that we can use in our careers and in our everyday lives as well.
I guess to add to that, and it feels to be very similar around, it's one thing to elicit to get information, but I think some of those same tools are ways to deepen connections with people. Like when you say, I was taught early on in my training, if you're kind of doing some reflective listening and you're reflecting back to someone what you heard, the temptation is to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I heard. And the psychology of that is you're kind of setting it up and you're not really committed to what you're kind of showing them you're kind of half listening, or
Yeah.
versus just say what you feel like you heard and then trust that they're going to correct what they need to correct. And so worst case, you say the wrong thing and you get the right thing. Like kind of what you're saying with, it's not Thai food, it's pizza.
Yeah.
But kind of committing, and you got to commit to being a good listener to be able to make that bold claim, but
Yeah.
kind of that correct me if I'm wrong, but it's really hard to kind of weed that out of our conversation because we don't want to offend. We want to make sure but it's kind of giving that other person the benefit of the doubt, like they're going to set the record straight. So
Right.
just say the thing.
I agree. It kind of puts it back on them in a way that feels almost a little intrusive to me. And people think they're being very courteous when they do it,
Hmm.
and they say, "This is what I'm hearing from you." And it's like, okay, I kind of recoil when I hear that these days, because I prefer these other techniques, these other methods. I prefer good listening. I write about note taking and aspects of that.
Kind of overlapping tool that I saw in your book was even just mirroring. So talk a little bit about mirroring and maybe how that plays a part.
Yeah, I always say that physical mirroring is something that is taught in the business world. A lot of people know what it is. It's the physical replication of another person's body language, and then and I'll get into this. I have a build on it about that I think can make it more effective. But mirroring is great, and we should all be mirroring people that we're trying to talk to. And that doesn't mean throwing your personality out the window. Okay, if you're somebody who speaks with a lot of body language and you're talking to someone who's phlegmatic and still and calm, you don't want to turn yourself into a statue, because you'll just make yourself awkward. But big picture things, if your client is leaning forward, elbows on the table, excited to hear what you have to say, I joke around and say you don't want to be, Don Draper, Mr. Cool Guy with your legs crossed, leaning back. You want to meet them where they are. The human mind has mirror neurons. It's been shown in many studies. And when we see people behaving like us, it gives us comfort and it makes us think this person's on my side. That can be a little bit insidious when it comes to hiring practices, socially, questions of race, ethnicity, social strata. Those are all complicated, but you can use that when you're cultivating people in the business world or your social life by just doing subtle things, like standing in a similar posture or at a certain distance, how they're sitting at a table with you. Those subtle things can mean a lot. And what I call the varsity move of mirroring is doing what FBI hostage negotiators are so good at doing, which is verbal mirroring. Of course, hostage negotiators, and Derek, you've read my book, so part of my work has been in the world of kidnap-for-ransom consulting, which is a fascinating space. And I've learned from these people. And when you're in a hostage siege, you're not able to physically mirror somebody because you're at a distance from them. So these FBI hostage negotiators are incredibly good at using the same language that they're getting from that individual back to them, right? And we can all do that, right? And they tell you to look for colloquialisms or pet words. And I always say I have one friend that says 100% a lot instead of yes, and another that says by the way as a crutch in conversation. And I practice my verbal mirroring chops by doing that with these people, even though I have great rapport with them already. And that helps me to sharpen that tool in my toolkit. So I urge people to lean in on physical and verbal mirroring, and it's definitely the one getting as a final point on practicing, and I still do it with friends, you want to practice mirroring in more low stakes environment, because if you do it poorly amongst all the techniques I teach, it can backfire on you. And you don't want someone thinking that you're mocking them or copying them. That can really go wrong. So do it with friends and family. Start slow. If you mess up with people you're close to, they can just tease you. But start slowly. But it is a great way to build rapport.
You mentioned the hostage negotiation. One of the stories in the book that I think resonated with me, and I think there were a lot of key learnings from it. Can you share just a little bit about the Montana Freeman and how the hostage negotiators strategically went through just that whole situation?
It involves my buddy Gary Nessner, who is kind of a big deal now. He's been on every kind of Waco documentary. Michael Shannon played him in the series, and he's a great, great guy. And his book "Stalling for Time" is a good read, and that's a good example. The Freeman encounter is a good example of why that's called stalling for time, and it's a good example of when you have a conflict. People's tendency is to want to try to get it resolved right away. But if you're a leader and you're dealing with somebody and you're not getting there, call a timeout, and talk later, talk the next day. Especially if it's emotional, people will have a chance to calm down, because emotion chokes cognition. If you get emotional, it's harder to think. And hostage negotiators know that. So they stall for time many times. And that's one of the reasons why sieges like the Montana Freemen one and many others go quite a while, because they can be emotional. These stakes are high. But one of the things that Gary and his colleagues did was, some of the compatriots of these Freemen showed up at the FBI installment, and they were making some very loud accusations of things that they were going to do. I believe it was post Waco. I could be wrong about that, but I believe these people were concerned that they were going to go in there with tanks and guns blazing, and they had the wrong idea about how close they were, how what was pointed at the place. So they met with these guys, and they offered to take them to the front line, and they just wanted to show them, hey, here's what we're doing. And these guys, at first, they were very rude. They offered to shake hands, and they basically told them to F off, and but they didn't take offense. And that's a big thing for Gary too. Let it be like water rolling off a duck's back. The guy says, hey, you're a real jerk, and you should talk to my wife sometimes, she might think that too. They're so good at that kind of thing. And I have to remember that I can lose my temper too. And, it doesn't serve you well to lose your temper in almost every case. So trying to remain calm and giving it time and talking things through is a really good way to do it. And it also speaks to, what I write about in the book about diffusing difficult encounters. If someone's kind of yelling at you, you're an office leader, someone comes into your office, they're really pissed about something, they're raising their voice. Don't raise your voice. Continue to speak to them in a calm, cool manner. And people, the big picture takeaway here is, people tend to revert to the social mean that you're insisting on. So if you insist on responding to them as they're shouting and yelling and, cursing at you, and you respond in a calm, straightforward manner, they tend to kind of calm down based on that. If someone is standing and shouting at you, invite them to sit. Sitting usually calms things down, and don't stand up if they are, because that will just raise the temperature in the room. And then, invite people to be a part of the solution. And what I find is that many times in the emotional moment, if you ask them, what do you think is a good path forward here? They might say something, outrageous. This person should be fired. And then after they say that, and and unwind a little bit after saying something that kind of extreme, it kind of deflates them a little bit. They might realize they're being extreme, right? And it just gets it out there. So I write about a variety of ways we can calm these difficult encounters and bring emotional situations, just as Gary and his team did in Montana, to a more positive resolution.
Everybody gets elevated. I think about from the boardroom to argument with a spouse or with kids. I mean, we all daily have opportunities to get elevated, and the reality is none of us are at our best cognitively when several of those stress hormones are coursing through our veins. And I would say this on a practical level, and I see this all the time in the therapy space, but then also as I'm working with organizational leaders, the number one thing you can do whenever you're thinking about crisis situations or challenging conversations is to try to get your body regulated. It's some people immediately go to attacking something cognitively, but physically they're elevated and their brain functions at 50%, and you're sitting here making cognitive decisions when you're not, your prefrontal cortex is partially or fully shut down. And so I would just say to whoever's listening, like, that's such an important principle. Of just wanted to
Yeah, I
reiterate.
agree. And, breathing is so important. Long, drawn in breaths, holding them. That's a good way to quickly do it. I was reading something the other day that said I'm a big exercise person. And if you have a stressful event and you can exercise before it, that's going to put you in a better position. So, yes, you have to listen to the body as much as the mind for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways, different grounding techniques. You can utilize that with relaxation strategies that there's many you can do. And the beauty of a lot of these, you can target specific parts of the body that typically get hijacked with stress. And so the reason breathing works is, one, that stress hijacks that and you start to hyperventilate. But when you do deep breathing, you're doing the opposite of it. And your brain's like, oh, we don't need to go into a higher stress response right now because you're doing deep breathing. Okay, let's have a reduction on the cortisol that's being released, and so you do start to counteract the typical fight, flight, freeze response, and you can really reverse that pretty quickly, and it works pretty quickly. It takes practice. I know the latter part of the book you talk about even just the ethics of espionage, the ethics of the spycraft, and so share a little bit about what's your learnings around ethics. That's not a lot what people put together due to a lot of movies and how it seems like a lot of unethical spy behavior. But just, I don't know, give your take on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, again, I'm on a mission to sort of, change the way spies are perceived. And, there's one of the, obviously there have been black marks on the CIA. There's most recently the sort of, the torture scandals after 9/11, which is very complex, driven by the top levels of the government, the pressures of the time. But there's a saying amongst case officers that spies convince, thugs coerce, right? So spies are very proud of their ability to convince people and not do something unethical. The CIA doesn't believe in blackmail. I'm not saying that never happens, but in generally speaking, it's not a great way. Just like torture, to get information, it's unreliable. The people hate you. All of those things. It's better to win somebody over. In terms of the broader ethical landscape, I don't know if I'll remember the exact framework specifically, but in the 90s, the CIA had a bit of an ethics challenge, and they turned to Bob Grenier. Bob wrote the foreword to my book. Had an amazing career at the agency, was the station chief in Islamabad, Pakistan when 9/11 happened, was the first U.S. official to meet with the Taliban after the attack. And he writes about that experience in the foreword to my book and how he almost made a sale, if you will, that would have changed the nature of history. And he actually thought he did. So it's a pretty cool story for those who haven't checked it out. But Bob finished his career as head of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, which oversees all of the counterterrorism efforts around the world. In any case, Bob was a rising case officer in the mid 90s, and he was asked during the Clinton administration to create a program of ethics for the CIA. Because previously it was more like, well, it's either something you have or you don't, and they realized they need to give people a sense of ethics, right? What are the ethical priorities of a case officer? So again, I don't know if I'll get this exactly right off the top of my head. I haven't thought about it in a bit, but the idea is that, there are several competing priorities that the case officer might be thinking about, faith and fidelity to U.S. laws and the Constitution, preserving the reputation of the CIA, adhering to the mission, the safety of the agent. So Bob and his team tried to give a framework for how case officers should think about that. And, it definitely was, faith in the U.S. laws is at the top of it. The mission is usually the next one, which is incredibly important national security things. And then protecting the agent. The agency cares a lot about the people they've asked to risk their lives for. And then, protecting the agency's reputation comes lower on the spectrum than those other details. Okay. And that's important to remember, because they don't want a case officer who's thinking of who's on an important mission to think, if I blow this, it could really hurt the agency's reputation. They want that person to go ahead with the mission. And this has analogies to corporate life, because, most businesses, whether they're public or private, seek to make money. So we can call that one of the, priorities of the company. Many times there are other philosophies at work there. We want to be good environmental stewards. We value our support for charitable causes like cancer research. We at this company are good colleagues, and we do X, Y, Z. What are the most important things to a company? How do you message the ethics of things? And especially in industries where the ethics can be a little bit of a gray area. Like I do a lot of work in financial services. People think they can kind of bend the rules to make a trade. You start explaining things away, and your ethical compass slips. I would want to work with an investment bank that says, we're here to make money, but that's number two over, good ethics and making sure we're on the right side of the law. So while many companies might say, yes, our first priority is making money, I think if you're, in financial services, you run the risk of blowing up your entire institution if you don't put as the number one priority adherence to all laws and ethical standards that we lay out for our people. So I think leaders should try, and I haven't done it as much lately, but I have done, it's after my book came out, and it's been about a year, quite a bit of ethics training with leaders. And I really enjoyed doing it because it really opens eyes for people to give them that kind of framework, because a lot of people haven't thought about it before.
I guess go ahead and plug a little bit of, or whatever you want to plug. I know we talked about your book, talk about your work, where people can get connected with you.
Yeah, the book is, wherever you want to go buy books. It's called Sell Like a Spy. It's part handbook on these communication skills. It's part memoir of, a somewhat unique career overseas, reporting on intelligence and foreign policy, and, taking maybe a road a little less traveled. There's a lot of baseball in there because I'm a big baseball fan, and I talk about how to, one of the way you have to find
Mets or
ways.
Yankees?
Oh, huge Yankee fan. Unfortunately, we're really struggling right now. But you need to find passions to lean into, and I write a lot about that. And I'm a big believer in that, and I'm fairly evangelical about it. So, still really all about the book. It's available on Audible, ebooks, all of that. I do a lot of keynote speaking at conferences. I'm available for that. I do customized trainings for a variety of well-known clients, and I post with some regularity, despite a deep cynicism. I post on LinkedIn, cynical about social media to some extent. And my website is sellikaspy.net, and you can see examples of me speaking. I write about foreign policy. There's details there as well. And hopefully a good, resource into sort of thinking differently about ways you might connect with people and overcome a variety of communication challenges.
I think you have a great speaking voice, and I was able to hear that when I listened. I was sharing this with you before. I listened to the audiobook, and it's you're reading your own book too. So I got to, yeah, I guess I spent a lot of time listening, working on my listening skills with you, Jeremy. Well, I really appreciate you just sharing some of these insights, and definitely encourage people to pick up the book. There's a lot of great stories in there that we definitely didn't have time to get to today that are very practical and that speak from a lot of different experience that Jeremy has and shares with us. And so definitely appreciate you coming on and talking to the audience.
It's my pleasure and honor. Thank you, Derek.